Did you know if Scotland became independent, it would own 90% of the UK's oil reserves, control most of the renewable energy, and potentially have a GDP per capita higher than the UK average? But it could also lose access to the British pound, face a massive budget deficit, and be forced to reapply to the UK like a brand new nation. Scotland's independence isn't just political, it's deeply economic. And today, we are unpacking the real numbers, the hidden risks, the surprising opportunities, and the stories you have not been told. From someone who has walked the streets of Edinburgh, driven across the Isle of Skye, and felt the heartbeat of Glasgow. This isn't about taking sides, it's about pulling back the curtain. So let's go deep. Because whether you are in the UK, Europe, or watching from across the world, what happens in Scotland might just rewrite the future of nations everywhere. Let's start with a simple question. Why does Scotland even want independence? Because on the surface, Scotland and England speak the same language. They're part of the same kingdom, same passport, same military, same Netflix account. Well, probably. But underneath, there's a long, complicated history of power, identity, and economics. Back in 1707, the Act of Union merged Scotland and England into the United Kingdom. It wasn't exactly romantic, it was more like a financial rescue. Scotland was broke, England had global ambitions, so a deal was made. But fast forward 300 plus years and the cracks are still there. You see, Scotland never stopped being Scottish. It kept its own legal system, its own education system, even its own national football team. And trust me, they take that very seriously in Scotland. When I visited Glasgow, the pride in the city was something else. The murals, the local pubs, the energy. It didn't feel like a UK outpost. It felt like a nation within a nation. And this tension exploded in 2014 when Scotland held a referendum to become independent. The result? 55% said no. But here's the twist, nearly every major Scottish city said yes. And then came Brexit. In 2016, the UK voted to leave the EU. But Scotland, 62% voted to stay. Suddenly people in Edinburgh and beyond were asking, why are we being pulled out of the EU when we clearly voted against it? When I walked through Edinburgh near Holyrood and the Parliament building, that question was written on protest signs, pub chalkboards, even overheard in cafes. And that's why we are here today, because now the calls for independence are back, louder, sharper, and more economically focused than ever. But before we dive into the money, the oil, the currency, the trade, let's ask the next big question. What would Scotland even look like alone? Stay with me, we are just getting started. Alright, let's talk oil. Because when we talk about Scottish independence, we are not just talking about kilts, bagpipes, or Braveheart speeches. We are talking about billions in black gold sitting just offshore. Right now, an estimated 90% of the UK's oil and gas production comes from the Scottish sector of the North Sea. Let me say that again, 90%. That means if Scotland goes independent, it walks away with a massive energy inheritance. Back in the 1980s, this oil boom was dubbed Scotland's golden opportunity. Some even called it the chance to become the Norway of the UK. Norway, by the way, used its oil revenues to build a $1.6 trillion sovereign wealth fund. Scotland, it sent most of the oil profits straight to Westminster. When I visited Edinburgh, I remember walking past the Parliament building thinking, what if this city had full control of that wealth? Would its future look different? But here's the catch. Oil isn't forever. Production peaked around 1999 and has been slowly declining since. So while there's still value, and yes, recent discoveries keep adding billions, the clock is ticking. That brings us to the next big card Scotland holds. Scotland isn't just sitting on oil, it's riding the wind. It currently produces almost 100% of its electricity demand from renewables. You heard that right. And most of that is wind power, both onshore and offshore, some of the strongest in Europe. In fact, the Isle of Skye, which I had the chance to drive across, is one of the most stunning examples of this renewable shift. Miles of untouched terrain, fresh air, and wind you can feel pushing against your car. And that wind is now powering homes across the country. Scotland doesn't just have resources, it has the infrastructure, and most importantly, it has the future energy economy. So what does that mean in plain terms? If Scotland becomes independent, it could sell power to the rest of the UK. It could export green electricity to Europe, and it could even use that leverage to bargain EU membership from a position of strength. And here's the twist: owning energy doesn't automatically mean owning profit. Much of the energy infrastructure is still owned by UK companies, foreign investors, or private entities, and nationalizing them or taking control could spark legal fights that drag on for years, possibly costing billions. So, Scotland would have to negotiate who owns the oil platforms, who owns the transmission lines, who gets what share of that profit pie. It's a messy divorce. Even with all these resources, Scotland still spends more per person on public services than it raises in taxes, which leads us to the £1 billion question. Can Scotland afford to go alone? Well, let's talk numbers. Okay, let's get to the heart of the matter, because energy is one thing, but the real fight over independence, it's about money. What currency would Scotland use? Who pays the UK's national debt? And can Scotland survive without Westminster's financial safety net? Let's check. Right now, Scotland uses the British pound, but it doesn't control it. Scotland can print banknotes. Yes, those fancy looking Scottish notes you get in Edinburgh shops. But the power over interest rates, inflation, money supply, and credit flow, that all sits with the Bank of England in London. So if Scotland became independent, it would need to decide whether to keep using the pound informally, like Panama uses the US dollar, create a new Scottish currency, apply to join the euro. Each option has huge implications. Using the pound informally, sure, it's simple at first, but without control over monetary policy, Scotland becomes a passenger in its own economy. Creating a new currency that gives independence over inflation, interest rates, and central banking. But it also means markets might panic, credit rating agencies might downgrade it, and investors could get nervous. What about joining the euro? That requires rejoining the EU first, and the EU doesn't let new members keep the pound. So you would need to create your own currency anyway, just to switch to the euro later. Would people trust a brand new Scottish currency? Would businesses, banks, tourists? But if they don't, inflation, capital flight, and market panic aren't far behind. And that brings us to the deficit problem. According to the latest numbers from GERS, that's the Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland report, the country is running a fiscal deficit of nearly 9% of GDP. Let me simplify. For every £100 Scotland spends on schools, hospitals, roads, and pensions, it's only raising about £91 in tax. The shortfall covered by UK-wide borrowing, basically by Westminster. Now imagine independence happens. That financial buffer disappears overnight. Scotland either has to raise taxes, cut spending, or borrow more, and at higher interest rates than the UK. Is a sensitive one. Scotland helped build the UK, so logically, if it leaves, does it also inherit a share of the national debt? UK debt currently sits around £2.7 trillion. Scotland's population is roughly 8.2% of the UK total. That's around £220 billion in shared responsibility if we go by population. But independent supporters say we didn't run up that debt. Why should we pay for wars, Trident, or HS2 we never wanted? The UK might say if you want a share of the Bank of England's reserves or assets, you need to take your share of the debt too. It's a negotiation nightmare. And in international law, there's no hard rule. It all depends on politics, pressure, and perception. So, unless Scotland finds a credible plan for currency, debt, and deficit, independence could cost more than peace. But that's just half the story. Because what if Scotland played the smart? What if it rejoined the EU, became a tech and energy hub, and positioned itself like Ireland 2.0? What if it turned its size into agility and its culture into an economic brand? That's what we explore next. Let's shift gears for a second, because up till now we have looked at the risks, the deficits, the currency challenges, the debt question. What if we ask a different question? What if Scotland not only survives but thrives? Let's take a quick tour. Ireland, about the same size as Scotland, left the UK in the 1920s, went from poor and agrarian to one of Europe's richest. How did they do it? Low corporate tax, EU membership, English-speaking workforce, and massive foreign investment, especially in tech and pharma. Estonia, a tiny Baltic state that was once under Soviet control, now known as a digital society, paperless bureaucracy, startup hubs, and remote citizenship. Singapore, no natural resources, surrounded by giants, yet it became a global finance and trade hub through smart policies, infrastructure, and education. So why not Scotland? Let's talk assets. World-class universities, Edinburgh, Glasgow, St Andrews, all globally respected. Scotland produces talent in engineering, medicine, AI, and climate science. Clean energy, superpower potential, wind, hydro, and tidal energy. It already exports electricity to England and could soon be a net exporter to Europe. Brand value. Let's be honest, Scotland sells from whiskey to wool, from golf to the Highlands. The global love for Scottish identity is real. Just like how Made in Italy sells fashion, Made in Scotland could sell green tech, premium food and drink, heritage tourism, and more. If Scotland rejoins the EU, and yes, that's a big if, it could become a gateway between the UK and Europe, a sort of bridge state speaking the same language as the UK, but operating within the EU single market. Think of Ireland's advantage during Brexit, attracting companies who still wanted EU access but preferred an English-speaking base. Scotland could do the same, especially with stable institutions, EU-aligned values, a digitally savvy, educated population, and massive offshore wind capacity to sell clean power to the continent. When I drove through the Isle of Skye, it felt spiritual, not just because of the scenery, which is otherworldly, but because there was a stillness, a sense of scale. You realize just how much land, water, and power lies here, untapped, underleveraged. This isn't a place that needs to be saved, it's a place that needs to be unlocked. Scotland already has a tech startup scene, especially in Edinburgh and Glasgow. AI companies, fintech apps, green energy, innovators, many of them already attracting investment. With independence, Scotland could create tailored R&D, tax incentives, build a digitally friendly regulatory environment, establish itself as a tech haven like Estonia or Finland. So, could Scotland thrive? If, and again it's a big if, Scotland manages to create a credible currency plan, rejoin the EU, or negotiate smart trade deals, leverage its energy assets and tech sector, stay fiscally disciplined in the early years, then yes, not just survive but thrive. Of course, none of this happens overnight. Independence isn't magic. It's not a shortcut to prosperity, it's a reset. And resets are hard. Which brings us to the other side of the coin. What could go wrong? So we have explored Scotland's potential, its energy, tech, people, power. But what about the risks? The stuff politicians gloss over, the warnings buried beneath the headlines, the uncomfortable truths. Brain drain and business flight. Let's say Scotland becomes independent. What happens the next day? Some businesses may relocate, especially banks, asset managers, and insurance firms who want regulatory clarity. In fact, before the 2014 referendum, major institutions like RBS and Lloyds hinted they would move headquarters to London if a yes vote was passed. That doesn't mean a full collapse, but it does mean initial disruption and possibly loss of high paying jobs. And with job loss comes brain drain. Young, educated professionals might move south to chase stability, especially if Scotland's current currency situation remains vague. A common pre independence argument is we will just rejoin the EU. But the EU doesn't operate on vibes, it operates on criteria. To join the EU, a new country must meet the Copenhagen criteria, including stable institutions, rule of law, functioning market economy, and alignment with EU laws. Also, it needs its own currency and central bank. That's right. To join the EU, Scotland would first need to leave the pound and create its own monetary system. And it doesn't stop there. Spain, which has its own independence issues with Catalonia, might veto Scottish accession just to avoid setting a precedent. So even if the EU likes Scotland, politics could delay or derail the process. Meaning, Scotland could end up in a no man's land outside the UK but not yet inside the EU. That limbo could hurt trade, investment, migration, and morale. Here's the practical problem. If Scotland rejoins the EU and the UK stays out, then the Scotland-England border becomes an external EU border. What does that mean? Customs checks, regulations, tariffs, friction. And remember, England is by far Scotland's biggest trading partner. Around 60% of Scottish exports go to the rest of the UK. Now imagine trucks delayed at the border, fresh fish exports held up, whiskey shipments double checked for EU compliance. Scotland could trade more with Europe, sure, but that would take time. Border friction could cost Scottish businesses millions, especially in the early years. The oil may not save Scotland. Back in the 70s and 80s, Scottish independence dreams were powered by one word, oil. But oil is declining. North Sea production peaked in 1999 and has been failing since. Yes, new fields are still being explored. Yes, the price of oil fluctuates and sometimes surges, but the trend downward. And even if oil revenue spikes temporarily, it's not consistent enough to fund the nation long term. Plus, we are entering an age of net zero, green transitions, and fossil fuel divestment. Right now, Scotland spends more per person on public services than the rest of the UK. Free university education, free prescriptions, council tax freezes, childcare subsidies. All of that comes at a cost currently subsidized by UK-wide borrowing. If Scotland goes independent with a 9% fiscal deficit, it may need to cut public spending, raise taxes, or borrow at much higher rates. None of those are politically easy. And if a new government tries to keep all existing benefits while also taking on new expenses, defense, embassies, regulators, the budget could stretch thin very quickly. So, here is a question. Why are so many Scots still saying yes? Why does the independence movement remain alive even after the 2014 defeat, even after Brexit, even with all the economic risks on the table? It's because independence isn't just about money. Identity over GDP. What's the value of identity? Can you put a price tag on dignity, self determination, or the right to make your own choices as a nation? It's about the belief that we can govern ourselves, and now, if we fail, it's our failure, not someone else's imposed fate. Number two, the Brexit betrayal. In 2014, when Scots voted no to independence, many did so partly because they wanted to stay in the EU as part of the UK. But just 2 years later, that was taken away. Scotland voted 62% remain. England and Wales voted leave. And boom, out they went. That moment shifted the emotional landscape because for many it proved that Scotland's voice doesn't carry real weight in UK wide decisions. If you have ever felt outvoted in your own home, you know what that feels like. Scotland's desire for independence isn't new, it's centuries old, from William Wallace and Robert the Bruce to the Act of Union in 1707, to the failed referendums and the modern devolution movements. This story runs deep. It's not about hating England, it's about wanting to decide your own future like any nation should be allowed to. That's why, when some dismiss independence as economic suicide, many Scots see that as missing the point entirely, because to them, it's not about perfect numbers, it's about being seen, heard, respected. Number four, the devolution dilemma. Scotland already has its own parliament, its own education system, its own health policies, even its own law system. So here's the question, if Scotland already governs so much, why not govern it all? Many Scots feel they are doing the hard part but without the final say. They don't control foreign policy, they don't control immigration, they don't control major tax levers, and they definitely don't control monetary policy. So in a way, independence isn't about revolution, it's about completion, taking what's already there and finishing the job. I spoke to a young couple in Glasgow, one Scottish, one English, both in their 30s, raising a child. They weren't sure about independence, but one thing they told me stuck with me. If it meant our child could grow up in a fairer, more equal, greener country, we would take the risk. That's what it boils down to, hope. The Yes campaign in 2014 wasn't just about rejecting the UK, it was about believing in something better. And even today, amid all the political noise and economic warnings, that hope still flickers. For some, independence is a way to build a new nation from the ground up, aligned with their values, their priorities, and their people. And you know what? That matters. Even if the spreadsheets don't agree, even if the risks are real. Because economics can tell us how the world works, but identity tells us why we fight for it. So after all that, where does this leave Scotland? Where does it leave the United Kingdom? And what does it mean for the rest of us watching, wondering? Let's look ahead. Is another referendum coming? First things first, is another vote even possible? Technically, only the UK government in Westminster can approve another legally binding referendum, and right now that permission is being denied. In 2022, the UK Supreme Court ruled that Scotland can't hold another independence vote without UK approval, which means for now the debate is frozen in legal limbo. But politics changes, governments change, public pressure builds. And the idea of a second independence referendum, IndyRef 2, hasn't gone away. In fact, it's growing stronger, not weaker. In 2014, the yes side lost with 45% of the vote. Not a landslide, but not a disaster either. Today, polls show the country is almost evenly split, with the needle swinging slightly depending on events. But if there's one thing that's clear, the next independence campaign would have to be different, smarter, sharper, more detailed, more credible. Because this time it's not enough to say we'll figure it out later. People want answers. What currency? What happens to pensions? How to trade with England? How fast can they rejoin the EU? What happens to defense, debt, and healthcare? If the yes side builds a solid, fact-based, future-looking case, backed by economists, lawyers, and negotiators, the vote could flip. But without that, it risks becoming another emotional leap into the unknown. Let's say independence doesn't happen or doesn't happen yet. Could there be a third way? Some experts and leaders suggest a compromise, Devomax, giving Scotland full control over everything except defence and foreign affairs. Kind of like Quebec in Canada or Catalonia in Spain before things got messy. This path could preserve the UK, respect Scottish identity, avoid border complications, and allow Scotland to build its own economic vision within the Union. But, and this is important, Devomax only works if it's real, not just PR, not symbolic. It would require true power sharing, constitutional reforms, and trust, which, let's be honest, is in short supply right now. I've walked through the Royal Mile, sat in quiet cafes in Edinburgh, listened to old folk music in Skye, watched kids chase pigeons across George Square in Glasgow. And I've felt it, this deep, unshakable truth. Scotland is already a nation. Whether or not it becomes independent, it already has a culture, a history, a future. The only question left is who gets to shape that future. So whether you're Scottish, English, British, European, or just someone interested in how the world works, I hope this gave you something deeper than a headline, something beyond yes or no, beyond the noise. Because independence isn't a simple choice, it's a story, a journey, a leap of faith, one way or another. And that story is still being written. If you found this video insightful, share it with someone who cares about Scotland, about nationhood, or about economic truth beyond politics. Comment below with your take. Would independence make Scotland stronger or weaker? And if you have been to Scotland, what did you feel there? I'll see you in the comments. Thanks for watching. Sláinte mhath.